Well, good morning. The only one that cares about that is my mother, and she's not here, so. It is an absolute delight to be back in Dayton. Actually, right now, it's great to be anywhere besides Washington. I am confident that you all understand that, but it is marvelous to be back and be able to look, and I'm looking at my Army colonel over here when I say this, it is great to see a sea of blue and be back part of this family. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here. More importantly, thank you for what you do each and every day. I asked General McMurray what he wanted me to talk about. He said about 30 minutes. And then let you talk and ask me questions, so we will take that approach, and I will attempt to finish at 30 minutes and then see what is on your mind and have the opportunity to engage in hopefully a meaningful dialogue. My focus today is on perspective. And so what I'll share is, and hopefully encourage you to do, is think about perspective. Let me start with 3 stories. Last night, my military assistant and I got in. We got in early enough to get some dinner, which when you fly out of gate 35X at Washington National is always a real question. When you leave Washington and come to Dayton with the weather, it's always a question. But last night, it happened to work out very well, and so we made it on time. And since my military assistant is an Army fellow, he had never been to Dayton, and he had obviously never been to the Pine Club. And so I took him to the Pine Club last evening for a steak to be able to enjoy that. And as always, when you go to the Pine Club, there is a wait to be able to be seated and to be able to eat. And so we sat there, and as we sat there, a gentleman and his wife came in and sat down next to us, also waiting for a table, a very gregarious fellow. And he started by saying, "Guess where I was last weekend?" Hadn't even introduced himself, never seen this guy once in my life. And I looked at him and said, "I have no idea where you were last weekend." He goes, "I was at Pebble Beach to watch the US Open because I am now 80 years young, and by gosh, I was going to go do something I'd never done." The key there was the words that he used, and that was 80 years young. That's a perspective. And last night after I finished eating, I thought to myself, if I didn't know how old I was, how old would I think I was? And this guy had a perspective that was just absolutely fantastic. And I appreciate it. He went on to tell us that he walked 9.5 miles on the course on Saturday, walked 6.5 miles on the course on Sunday, and he's going back in, I think, September or October to go play Pebble Beach with his son. Absolutely marvelous attitude, and he reminded me to think about how I think about issues. Story 1. Story 2, I looked at who was here and who's going to speak with you. And yesterday you had General Holmes, Commander of Air Combat Command, and I thought, brought a little smile to my face, and I thought, gosh, 1,000 years ago, when I used to be dressed like the military members in this audience, I was a speechwriter for then the commander of Tactical Air Command, the forerunner of Air Combat Command. How many have heard of Tactical Air Command? If you didn't, ask one of the old people around you that can describe it to you. And so I was thinking to myself, gosh, you know, there was a young speechwriter somewhere in his Commander's Action Group writing the remarks that he shared with you yesterday. That's what I used to do, and brought a smile to my face. And I thought to myself, God, the world has changed. That 4-star I worked for had to have been at least 2,000 years old, had been able to wander around with dinosaurs, and then I look at a picture of mobile homes, and I look at a picture of Arnie Bunch, and I'm going, God, they're just out of college. How can this happen? Hell, McMahon hasn't even gotten his driver's license yet. I mean, you look at this and it becomes perspective from where you sit and the way people look. And I thought to myself, one, I'm getting old, but two, the perspective as you look at the world from where you are versus where others are, how important that is. Story 3, and this is audience participation. Anybody from the B-52 program office here? Go ahead, raise your hand, don't be embarrassed. Okay. They're back at Tinker right now, I am confident, working on their software modernization plan as we speak. The irony of that is that when the first B-52 flew, the word software had never been used in print. First B-52 flew in 1952. The first recorded use of the word software was in 1958. A perspective. The perspective for you is, what is it that you should be thinking about today that doesn't even exist in thought or in word? What is it that your weapon system, your capability, that which you do doesn't even exist today, and yet your replacement or your replacement's replacement is going to have to deal with it? And more importantly, how do you prepare for that? First slide, please. It worked. This is, I'm a loggy, you know that. Those that know my background, this is not going to be a complex, highly integrated, acquisition-like conversation. It's going to be really simple. It goes back to my days in Squadron Officer School. 3 main points. They're really simple: acquisition, national defense strategy, sustainment. Let's start with acquisition. My intent here is to give you a perspective on some topics. Go ahead, next slide, please. And hopefully generate some interest on your part about some of the things that I'm going to mention, talk a little bit about, and then hopefully generate on yours in the question and answer period some additional conversation. How many of you are excited about the 5,000 series? Go ahead. This is audience participation. There are 2 of you. There's a doctor in the back. Please talk to him after you're done. When you look at the 5,000 series from a perspective, why did we create it? It was to be a guide. And then one of you or your predecessors 7,000 years ago screwed up, so we added another chapter to keep everybody else from doing that. And so now we require a C-17 to move a copy of the 5,000 series from one point to another, because that's the only weapon system we have that's large enough to carry it around. The reality is that we give you this giant set of guidance that becomes directive and very prescriptive, and then we use the word agility, and it doesn't work together. And so the intent is on my boss, Ellen Lord, who, oh, by the way, sends her regrets. She had to go to Paris for the Paris Air Show. I mean, she really would have much rather have come to Dayton than gone to Paris, but she felt obligated to go to Paris and talk with folks on a variety of issues, and so she sends her regrets. Kevin Fahey also would like to have been here, who's my counterpart for acquisition. Unfortunately, I think he's going to the White House today to get skewered on something. So, some discussion that we're going to have. So I have the opportunity to come back and be with you. But if she were here or Kevin were here, what they would tell you is that the guidance and the direction we give you doesn't match what we want you to do. Today you have the opportunity to try to opt out of elements within the 5000 series. When you look at 5002, for example. And so the question is, how do I go through a mother may I to opt out of certain things? The reality is, if we want to be agile in the way that we do business, it ought to be exactly the opposite. Is how do I opt into certain elements? Provide a much smaller document that gives you the opportunity to tailor what it is that you want to do to the environment that we're in. And then if you have to add something, to add it. And rather than what we have normally done is, when someone makes a mistake, we add 3 chapters. What we want to be able to do is give you a document that gives you the flexibility to be much more agile in the way that we acquire and sustain systems and capabilities. So we're in the midst of that today. The goal is that by the end of calendar year 2019, we will have rewritten this. We'll see how that goes. A lot of folks are working very, very hard on that. But at the end of the day, the intent is to give you something that gives you greater flexibility, gives you guidance, puts bumpers out there on your bowling alley, but allows you to move hopefully much more aggressively than what you can today. Topic 2, middle tier acquisition. How many have heard of middle tier acquisition? How many are doing middle tier acquisition? How many would not touch middle tier acquisition with a 10-foot pole? Good, because you ought to be. But from a perspective, the intent here is to be able to, in a parallel way, to develop and acquire in a concurrent way. Rapid prototyping, rapid development, rapid fielding. And so I encourage you to do that, to find those opportunities. But what it is not about is simply an opportunity to circumvent standard acquisition processes. I sat through a review earlier this week by a service not represented in this audience, with the exception of my Army colonel over there. Be a little generic in this conversation. But the reality is I listened to the conversation on this acquisition program. It wasn't necessarily about rapid prototyping and fielding. It was, how do I circumvent the current guidance that we have? That's the wrong motivation. That's the wrong concept for what it is that we ought to be doing from my perspective, and that isn't going to fly. But where you do have the opportunity to use this, the answer is figure out how to do it, ask for help if you need it, but please head that direction and utilize the agility that we're attempting to give you with that, with OTAs, and we talk about this. Do we understand fully how to do that? I don't think the answer is yes. I don't think anybody does, but engage and use it where it's where it's appropriate, but keep the perspective of why you're doing it versus what you're trying to circumvent. Cyber security. The challenge that you face as an audience, both on the government side and on the commercial side, is that you understand at probably tier 1, tier 2, what cybersecurity looks like, and you have absolutely no idea at tier 5 and tier 6 of how they're managing their data, how they're managing access, and what vulnerabilities are being created that will adversely affect your capability or your weapon system. It is a tremendous challenge. It is one, as I look at some of my friends over here from industry, that they are dealing with each and every day, that you're dealing as you deal with them, trying to understand. There are a whole lot of questions, and there are not a whole lot of answers today as we talk about that. One of the things you're going to begin to hear is about a cybersecurity CMMC maturity model certification. Think of ISO 9000, think of CMMI, think about that capability and that requirement for cybersecurity. Something from about a level 1 to a level 5, depending upon the complexity and what it is that we're trying to protect. If you're making boots for soldiers, the cybersecurity requirements for that aren't the same as if you're talking about a satellite or a weapon system like the B-21. And so it's applicable to the environment that you're in, but what are those requirements and capabilities? How do we educate? How do we certify? How do we ensure we can protect at all levels in this environment differently than we are today? I am confident there are at least a couple of opinions out in this audience about that, about it's another level of management on top of it, everything else that we ask you to do. But the reality is we've got to do something differently than we are today. And so the challenge is, how do we move forward? We're moving forward, I think, fairly aggressively in this area, but it is something that we've got to do. And I would encourage you to share with us your concerns, your thoughts on that as we move into the second half of the conversation. Motivating your OEM, your partner. Let me go back to perspective. When we create a capability, it's done by a team. That team is the government, and it is the private sector working together to generate a capability. How many from the commercial sector in the room? Go ahead and raise your hand. If you look from up here, what you do is you see them all kind of all sitting together in different groups for self-protection, I guess. I don't know. But the reality is that it is a team. And so the question becomes, how do you motivate your teammate? There are two tools. There are carrots and there are sticks. The reality is that hopefully that as you have this conversation, that there are carrots that you recognize, that they recognize, and you can find a collaborative way to be able to achieve that which you're trying to do. The reality is that in some cases, carrots don't work, and so you use another tool. Unfortunately, oftentimes, the conversation that should have precluded that never takes place. So what I encourage you is to take the perspective that whoever it is that you're working with, whatever that private sector entity is that's going to deliver this capability or system to you, that they want to do a good job. They deserve the right to earn a reasonable profit, and that together you can create and achieve whatever it is that you're attempting to achieve. It's the perspective as you go into it. Over my career, I've had the opportunity to sit on three different sides. Obviously, a long time ago in uniform on the government side. I spent some time with one of the larger OEMs on the private side. And now I have a chance to look from on high in OSD as I watch this process unfold. And what I often hear is this discussion on both sides that they don't get it. They have no idea what I expect. And you're right, because there is no they in this relationship. It's we. It's a perspective. And what I would offer to you, that as you look at how you deal, don't sell the farm either way. But if you take a we approach as opposed to a they approach, the perspective, that oftentimes the issues and the impediments that exist magically melt away. And you've at least given someone the opportunity to be as successful as they might be. DAU reset. How many are proud graduates of DAU at some point in time? How many of you remember anything you were taught there? A couple must have been recent graduates. What is the purpose of DAU? Is it education or is it training? And the answer is yes. I know when I went for whatever it was back in those days for level 3, I think I was there for 6 or 7 weeks. I lose track. I mean, it was a wonderful time to be at Fort Belvoir. I rode my bike a lot, sat through class, took all these rote tests, and at the end of the day, made some great friends, got a level 3 certification out of it. And then I went back and did what I needed to go do with a few more tools. If we're going to do and introduce new concepts, how do we do Agile, DevSecOps? What are the best examples of OTAs and middle tier acquisition? You shouldn't have to attend a 6-month class to understand that. How do we make DAU more agile than it is today? And Ms. Lord has tasked Jim Woolsey and the DAU team to think differently about what it is that they do. If you're about to begin a new software program and you don't have the expertise on Agile, why can't you go in for a 3-day course that gives you the basic skills that you need, not have to worry about certification in this case, and something to hang on your wall, but the skills and knowledge you need to go be prepared to go do that. A different context, just-in-time education, just-in-time training. To adapt to what you need rather than you have to adapt to what we told you needed because someone decided that. Fundamental perspective change. We're in the midst of doing that today, and you'll begin to hear more of that if you haven't already. Thinking differently about what DAU does and how it does it. And dare I say, might it be DAZU versus DAU? Adding the S for sustainment. Just a thought. And finally, as I talk about life cycle and acquisition, this concept of Agile. For 1,000 years, we talked about waterfall as the methodology for utilizing development of software. And now, if you want to win at acquisition bingo in the Pentagon, you have to use the word Agile, DevSecOps, and most folks have absolutely no earthly idea what you're talking about, but if you use it, everybody smiles. The reality is we have to do business differently. We have to be more creative. We have to be more flexible. We have to be quicker at what we do. This concept that we do a release every year, whether we need to or not, is ridiculous. And we know we can do it differently. We have got to evolve to that world. Lots of great efforts going on. Kessel Run, everybody hears that. There's all kinds of things with Lincoln Labs, great experience out there. In the private sector, the reality is we have just got to get on with this, but we've got to create the environment to include in the 5,000 series to give you the opportunity to go do that. And so to say go do that, but then give you this laundry list of hurdles to jump through doesn't make logical sense. So we've got to change our perspective, but I challenge you to do the same thing as you think about software development. Lots of opportunity, lots of folks are beginning to understand it, lots of opportunities to go evolve into that direction. All right, slide please. For the first time that I can ever remember, we have created a national defense strategy that is something besides a coffee table book. It is for us in the Pentagon, and should be for you, a roadmap of your thinking and how you allocate resources. 3 simple lines of effort. Improve, increase readiness and lethality. And I think General Holmes probably talked about that yesterday, how important that is. Secondly, creating alliances and partnerships, which, oh, by the way, happens to be the theme of your conference this week. And finally, reforming the way that you do business, which is a lot of what I just talked about. By the way, what is an acquisition program? What is the conclusion of an acquisition program? From a sustainment perspective, which is where I stand, it gets you to the starting line. All of that gets us to put a potential capability either in the air, in space, or on a ramp somewhere. It's potential energy, not kinetic energy. The next 10, 20, 70 years is that kinetic energy. And so acquiring something simply gets us to a point at the beginning of the process, not the end of the process. And so the decisions that we make up front drive everything we do for the last 70% of the cost and 90% of the life of the program. I'll talk more about that on the next slide. The decisions that we made 30 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 10 years ago are driving our readiness and lethality today. And so this isn't flipping a switch. It's evolving for these weapon systems to where we need to get to be and the capabilities that we need. The A-10 happens to still be around. How many have worked on the A-10? How many times have we attempted to kill the A-10? I mean, it's got more lives than a cat. So how, as a program manager, how do you deal with that? How do you continue to prepare for the future knowing that it's going to end? Those are tough challenges. But the point is, General Holmes doesn't care. It's tough to be you. Your job is to make sure, though, until the very end, that I've got all the capability I need. Where are we on the F-16? How many SLEPs have we done? F-15, B-52. Hello, we're talking about re-engineering the B-52? How do you do that? General Holmes doesn't care, he just expects you to do that. And so the challenge is, how do you as an acquisition professional think differently about ensuring that readiness and lethality, because the world is not getting any more safe. One need only look at the news this morning to understand that. And whether it is the fight that we have been in for the last 20 years against terrorism, which taught us a whole lot of lessons that are not relevant necessarily for the future, whether we look at the threat that China and Russia bring to us and how we have to prepare differently and affect a different behavior to be able to deal with that, or whether it is North Korea and now Iran in a way that is threatening to us. Concurrently, we've got to prepare for tonight's fight and the fight for 2025 and the fight for 2030, with budgets that will likely get smaller, and challenges that will get bigger. Insanity is doing the same thing and expecting different results. And so the challenge as acquisition professionals is, how do we do that differently in a way that allows us to get to where we need to be? Partnerships and alliances, it isn't just about making friends with NATO. It's your relationship, as I mentioned before, the perspective that your private partner, your commercial partner, your OEM is your partner, and how do I go do this differently than I've done before? And finally, as I talked before about reform, thinking differently about how we do acquisition and sustainment. Slide, please. So how do we think differently? Why do we worry about intellectual property? Because at some point in time, we're probably going to want to sustain that which we've gotten. So where does the conversation on intellectual property start? Probably before the RFP. Because that's the point at which we have the most leverage in the conversation that we need. How do we have that conversation differently? What do I need? Everything? The answer is wrong answer. What do I need? Understand it. Talk about it and figure out where you want to be in 30 years. Supply chain resilience. I've talked about cyber. Counterfeit. Is the data that you're looking at for acquiring fill in the blank actual data, or has somebody tampered with it? Diminishing manufacturing sources. How do each of you ensure that that supply chain remains viable in the future? Remains viable today? And how do I think about it differently? How do you create a viable organic and commercial industrial base? Executive Order 13806 directed us to look at the industrial base and figure out where we are and what those challenges are. You all have seen the unclassified report. Many of you have seen the classified report. It doesn't take a rocket scientist today to know that many of our capabilities that are critical to our national defense have not remained economically viable. And so what we have done is allow those capabilities to atrophy and go elsewhere. In most cases, to countries that are not necessarily our best friends. How do we deal with it? Critical materials that we need. How do we ensure that we have access to them in the future? How do we deal with it? How do we ensure that we keep this mix of both commercial and organic industrial base viable? Clearly today, as we continue to move towards weapon systems that are predominantly software, how much of that capacity is in the commercial sector and how much of that is in the organic sector? How do we balance that? And how do we ensure both remain viable? You impact that. It is your perspective that drives where we are. There are a lot of those that in the sustainment community don't think they think PBL is a four-letter word. The reality is it's a phenomenal tool, but I need it to be more agile. How do I create a more agile tool? How do I put a rheostat? How many know what the budget for 2022 looks like? Go ahead and raise your hand. How many know what the budget for 2020 looks like? Go ahead and raise your hand. I know what the president asked for. What's Congress going to give us? The answer is none of us has a clue. And if we got cut 30%, and I've committed to a PBL that's a 5-year PBL that has no adjustment capability to it, what have I just done to all the other weapon systems? So how do I put a rheostat on that in a way that allows us to flex if I don't have the funding that I need? Where will we be at war in 2021? And the answer is, how do I put a rheostat that says if I need to crank it up, I can do that? It sounds really easy. I've yet to see one that's as good as it should be. So my challenge to you is think differently about a PBL and give us that capability. And finally, I'll finish where I started, on the B-52 and the software modernization plan. Where are you on your systems, your capabilities that you're responsible for today, and more importantly, preparing for tomorrow? What doesn't exist today that you need to be thinking about, visioning, to ensure that your system, your capability, is ready for tomorrow? Very simply, our role is to deter aggression, and when deterrence fails, kick somebody's ass. And we've got to be ready to do both. The good news is that as I look across this audience, you understand that. Collectively, you've got the capability to do that. And I'm darn proud to be part of your team. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions. All right, first question. 6'6". Oh, man.
So with the appropriation or the authorization language in the last couple of years, been a lot of shift in where authorities lie within DoD. Give us your perspective on the size, makeup, and organization now of the OSD staff compared to what you're tasked to do. That's an easy one.
Great question. Who's got the next question? We do things for interesting reasons. First, that's a great question. When I was first approached about going to Washington and having this opportunity, there was a thing called acquisition technology and logistics. You had a single entity that owned acquisition, logistics, research, and engineering. And so you had the ability under a single boss to integrate all of that in a way that ensured you could take an approach that gave us an end-to-end assessment. Congress came in and said, that's too big, we can't work that way. We're going to take AT&L, we're going to split it in two. And we're going to create this thing called acquisition and sustainment, and we're going to create this thing called research and engineering. The reality is, every time you fix an issue, you create an issue. And so what we have now done is create some challenges that drive us to be personality dependent. I mean, to make this personal for you, and I will probably pull a scab off of for some of you, we went through and created in your command in about 2012 or so, a thing called the 5-center construct. And we solved X number of problems, and from my perspective, we've created a number of problems. And so every time we go through an organizational change, this is what occurs. As a logistician, I will tell you that we have always hired acquirers, and my boss gets mad when I say this, but we had before a big A, a big T, and a little L. We very likely could have had the environment today in my organization called acquisition and sustainment, a big A and a little S, and I will tell you my boss understands that and has put a lot of time into the S side. And so is the S as big as the A? The answer is no, but it's a whole lot bigger than it could have been, and I give my boss credit for that. But what we've done is create a chasm between research and engineering and acquisition and sustainment. And so we've got to figure out now via personality, how do we cross that bridge? And that is not necessarily an easy thing to do. So are we there yet? The answer is no. Are we trying to work through that? The answer is yes. Is it personality dependent? Instead of being organizationally dependent, the answer is no. So we've created that. Inside A&S, what we did was, as part of this process, take what used to be logistics and material readiness and what used to be energy installations and environment, and took those disparate environments and put it under one assistant secretary. I've got the opportunity to do that, so what it's given me is not only the opportunity to talk about logistics, material readiness, but I now have the opportunity to talk about climate change, housing privatization, the border wall, and PFAS and PFOA. So it's made my life exciting, but what it does is give us the opportunity when we talk about installations, the challenges that installations, and it's like standing up IMSC within the Air Force, you come to the realization that weapon systems and infrastructure have many of the same issues. And how you approach it ought to be the same. And because those different areas and never talk to each other, you didn't have the integration and the collaboration that you needed. So we've solved some issues, but we've also created some new ones. Are we better off? The answer's, from your perspective, it depends. But it is certainly a different environment and more challenging at that upper level to ensure that we're approaching acquisition in an integrated way more so than what we've done in the past. Very good question, sir, as I would have expected. Thank you. What else?
One question about what the plans are to address the second, third, fourth tier supply chain from cybersecurity attacks.
Are you from industry or government?
I'm from industry.
Okay, I'm looking forward to you telling me.
Well, we're offering up solutions. I had heard that your boss, I guess Ms. Lord, was looking to develop some plans for FY20.
Part of this is, no matter where you are in the supply chain, you're going to have a responsibility for ensuring that there is a minimum level of capability, and that capability that you should have, much like under ISO 9000, CMMI, will go through a certification process. And the complexity of that which you do, again, boots versus circuit cards versus IC chips, will drive the level of a complexity of that certification process. And so more of that will come out over the next probably 90 to 120 days as we have that conversation. That's a step in the right direction. The real challenge becomes not only, first of all, do you know the lineage at the fourth tier and fifth tier of where those parts come from? And who's touched them? And oh, by the way, that fifth tier called Bubba's Barbecue and IC chips, who really works there? And what do they do? And what's their background? And what's their lineage? Those are some of the complexities of the conversations that we're having today. Oh, by the way, the data that they're using, have they ensured that it's secure? Are they able, it's like trusted foundries. If it's not, what are they really doing? Those are the kind of, there's a whole lot of questions. There aren't nearly as many answers. And as we sit with industry and have that, I've not talked to anybody that wasn't comfortable through tier 1, tier 2, and probably down to tier 3. It's after that is understanding, and how do I drive that behavior? How do I ensure, and if the certification process is done, how do I ensure that they didn't invalidate or falsify the information that was provided? Those are all the real questions that I don't think we yet have answers for. I mean, the idea of a certification process is very good. It gets us in the right direction. But are there ways to circumvent that? The answer is yes. And if you're nefarious, it doesn't bother you to circumvent what you're doing. So I don't have a really good answer for you other than the fact that we're thinking about that as we move forward. Again, a good question. Thank you. They didn't want you to ask a question, apparently.
All right.
Oh, there we go.
There you go. Yeah, kind of a personal focus of mine over the years have been trying to get more life cycle requirements and sustainment requirements into our acquisition process early so that we're all focused on affecting the design and integrating the end product with whatever the eventual sustainment environment will be, because that's where you're going to drive a lot of cost savings. And we've gone back and forth on, and I'm interested in your thoughts on the success of that. Given the protest environment, it's difficult to put in a life cycle cost number or to put in some metrics that would really change how whatever the capability of weapon system being designed fits into the life cycle and the sustainment environment. On the commercial side, they have a lot more control in the end-to-end, so they can optimize both the design and the sustainment environment. It's always been a challenge for us. So I'm interested in what's your view of the progress and what can we do as a team, both industries, Chris Jones and Northrop Grumman, in government to advocate for that, because we're on board. We're going to get the bang for the buck, you know, like you said, before the RFP in the design phase versus dealing with the issues, you know, after the weapon systems design.
You and I have had this conversation a number of times.
Yeah.
And so part of this is, what is it, how do we motivate, how do we measure, how do we, what's success if you're acquiring a capability? Hypothetically, if you're the PM for the B-21, what is success? And what's success today at where we are versus 5 years from now versus 10 years from now? For the PM today, those factors may be different than from 10 years from now. The challenge is the decisions made today dramatically impact that 10-year period. And so part of this is an understanding and appreciation. You know, it's easy to say, oh, we have KPPs. That dog don't hunt real well. It just hasn't gotten us to where we need to be. I don't know that I have a good answer for you because we've not done that very well. I think there's an understanding, and there's some great case studies out there today that we're living through literally as we go, with the F-35 probably being the best example of it. You know, first of all, the F-35 is an absolutely phenomenal weapon system. We made a decision back 10 years ago that said we're going to hire the OEM, and you know, we're not going to worry about anything in terms of sustainment. We didn't even do the basic cataloging of the weapon system, so that when you look at a part number, serial number on the aircraft, it's not there's no national stock number, because we knew that the OEM was going to maintain that for the life of the weapon system. Well, guess what? World changed. And so a decision we made, we're now having to deal with it. And that isn't to say good or bad, it's not a judgment, it's the reality of where we are today. How do we do that differently? How do we make sure we don't make that mistake on the B-21? How do we, if we do a TISPR contract, a PBL, how do I ensure that at the end of whatever that contract period is, 5 years, 7 years, how do I ensure that if whoever I had that relationship with, if it didn't succeed, that I've got a viable off-ramp? What is it that I give myself the flexibility with up front to ensure that I've made the decision on intellectual property, that I have the process in place to be able to go make those decisions. I think part of this is just having conversations like this publicly that says we have to think about this differently. We have to encourage those conversations, and as we assess it, that we make sure that we've given ourselves the flexibility that we need. I'll go back to General McMurray's question earlier, which as we talk about the reorganization, part of what we've done is said, OSD is not going to do MDAPs. You know, we're going to push everything down to the services, and the services all smiles and get those people out of our hair. And I think Ms. Lord's gone from something like 75 or 78 to I think 8 or 9 right now that she's still got visibility on. The reality is, though, that, and I'm biased because it's where I stand, one of the things that we did was bring a open-minded perspective that allowed us to ask some of these questions. What's your sustainment strategy, not for the first 5 years? I don't care about that. It's probably going to be ICS because it's always ICS. The reality is, where am I going to be in 10 years? Well, this is what we're going to do. Okay, show me in your RFP that gives you the ability to go do that. So, back to your question, General McMurray, those are some of the things that I think we're losing today. And I think, quite frankly, and I can say this because it's not attribution and I'm not part of the organization anymore, I think that's one of the things we lost when we did 5-center construct. We put a divide between acquisition and sustainment that doesn't allow us to look at those questions as well as perhaps we did before when we had a different integrated structure. You all may have solved that. That's one of the things that I worry about, and I think we continue when we look at commercial and government being able to work together. Where is the sustainment questioning in that process, and is it viable, and is it energetic, and it is to the depth that we need? Because at the end of the day, when I drive 70% of the cost and life cycle costs, it's going to get a hell of a lot bigger if I don't have those conversations. All right, how many of you did I offend with that? Good. What else? I got one over. Yes, sir. Oh, no, don't give him a mic.
Mr. McMahon.
Mr. Owen.
It was great to hear you talking about DAU reset, and I love your new title of Defense Sustainment and Acquisition University. I think I heard it correctly, didn't I?
The acquisition folks would be upset if I said it, so it's DASU, not DSAU.
Maybe my hearing aids weren't tuned in, but thank you. I do have a question, though. I really appreciate, since you've assumed your current position as well as your previous position under the old structure, your focus on weapon system readiness. But what is your assessment of, across all the services, how are we doing on weapon system readiness, and is there any suggestion about how we might do better?
Very good question, sir. Thank you for the opportunity to talk a little bit about readiness from my perspective. When you look at, we'll stick with just the Air Force for right now since that's the audience. We have two kinds of doctors today. We have pediatricians and geriatric. And when you think about the weapons systems that we have, the issues that they face are entirely different, and yet in many cases are still the same. We have a finite amount of resources. We have an infinite number of requirements, and so the question, as we've always faced, whether we have big budgets or small, is how do we most effectively use those funds? I had the opportunity, as you know, to be on the C-17 on 3 different sides. As the customer and Air Mobility Command, on the government side, when I was at Robbins in program management, and then working for Boeing, running C-17 field operations. A phenomenal weapon system. Our ability to do what the nation asked us to do with that weapon system was absolutely phenomenal. Tremendous. I see you, Lynn. I know this is my last question. But the reality is, because the structure that we had with the PBL without a rheostat, that when the budget dropped, every other weapon system suffered. And so part one of the answer is we've got to think differently about PBL so that we have that rheostat in there to be able to adjust to the environment that we're in. Secondly, when we look at the structure within the Air Force, the other services want to replicate what we do today with CAM and the way that we allocate and take a holistic approach. And I think I applaud that because not everybody thinks the same way that this service does about how to allocate funds across a broader perspective. The reality is, from my perspective, that we have challenged this service when we identified specific weapon systems for a target at the expense of other weapon systems. And so that has challenged you to be able to do that with some of the issues that we have. When I look at the F-16 fleet, doing some great things. When I look at F-35, we're getting better, quite frankly, and I will tell you that I'm very optimistic about the future, not only in the capability of that weapon system, but I also think we're doing the right things, and this is about partnership, on both cost and availability. And those are all going the right direction, and you'll see more of that over time. F-22, I think there are a lot of good things that we're doing. But those were the three that we flagged when this thing called MC-80, and we focused there, but at what expense? What didn't get done? What impact was that on your working capital fund? And those are some of the challenges that we've got to think through, the unintended consequences for some of the things we're doing. You all have a remarkable infrastructure in your organic depot capability. Is it perfect? The answer is no. Could it be better? The answer is yes. Everything can always be better. But when I was in 2000, 1999, 2000, we went to go look at the Navy because they understood how to run an organic industrial base. By their own admission, they forgot how to do that. And so they're recreating what they had 2 decades ago to get to where they need to be. That was reflected in the F-18 and the horrific numbers that we had in terms of availability of the F-18. That's gotten a whole lot better in a fairly short period of time because we put the energy there. But the reality is that when we take our eye off the ball, bad things happen. And so when we think about what we do, it is to create deterrence. And when deterrence fails, is to kick somebody's butt. How we do that has to get better. And if you're in the acquisition or sustainment of a weapon system or of a capability, how do I do that better? How do I partner better? How do I think differently about what we need to go do? That's the challenge that you face. Excuse me, that's what we have to focus on together, because it isn't going to get any easier. The money isn't going to get any bigger, and the challenges aren't going to get any less. Lynn's telling me it's that time. Thank you again very much for the opportunity to be here. God bless, and God bless America.